What I'd like to do, with your permission, is to begin with a claim, an argument, that I'll then try to support. And then in our question and answer, you can tell me all the different ways in which I'm wrong. The claim is as follows. We are entering, and indeed have already entered, a new historical era. The post-Cold War period, which was the period that began roughly with the fall of the Berlin Wall and continued roughly until our withdrawal from Iraq, was a period that I think historians will recognize as characterized by two things. One, real American global hegemony, in which the United States emerged as the dominant world power both militarily after the fall of the Soviet Union and also economically after the information revolution gave us the opportunity to take the lead in technology. Second, as an era where the United States, over the decade between 2001 and 2011, subjected itself to a series of challenges, and I say subjected itself, that historians will have a really hard time explaining. I think historians will want to know how it could be that in the decade when China went from a middling power to a global superpower, in economic terms and increasingly in military terms, the United States spent almost all of its intellectual attention, all of its extra money, and the vast majority of its military might fighting wars in Iraq and Afghanistan that, as we know, did not in the end go anything near as well as we would have liked. And indeed, in the case of Iraq, we might perhaps have worked our way to a kind of stalemate at best. And in Afghanistan, we would be very lucky if that were the result. And indeed, there's good reason to believe that that will not be the result after we withdraw our troops. I think that we are entering this new historical era because of the rise of China during the decade in which the United States relative to China declined and China relative to the United States rose. And that sets the stage for what in classical international relations terms would be seen as a great power conflict. And great power conflict has a very specific historical form in which there is a single dominant power, sometimes called the status quo power, and it's challenged by a rising or revisionist power. And in classical international relations terms, this is a zero-sum conflict in which every gain for the rising power means a meaningful decline for the dominant power, again, in terms of their power measured relative to one another. But something very, very, very fundamental distinguishes this conflict between the United States and China from other great power conflicts in the past, most prominently the rise of Germany and its challenge to Britain that led to World War I. But you could really take this all the way back to the rise of Athens and its challenge to Sparta, which caused the Peloponnesian Wars, or a wide range of other historical examples. And the difference is this. China and the United States are profoundly economically interdependent with each other. As you know, the United States is China's largest trading power, accounting for almost a quarter of China's exports, and China's economy is still overwhelmingly export-driven. And for its part, the United States is enormously reliant on China for buying its debt. China owns about 8% of the outstanding US debt. And to give you some sense of comparison, that's more than any other single entity other than the Fed and the Social Security Trust Fund, which obviously in some sense are arms of the United States government. It's more than all US households combined. So it's an enormous degree of indebtedness and responsibility. If you want a recent concrete example of what this interdependence looks like, you could look at the headlines and see the recent acquisition by China of Smithfield, yet to be fully approved, but it certainly will be approved, which is the largest pork producer in the United States. It's about a $5 to $7 billion acquisition. And it's not the sort of thing that you do with your enemies. It's not the sort of thing that happened, for example, during the Cold War. There were no major Soviet conglomerates acquiring American conglomerates, or vice versa. There was extremely little trade between the Soviet Union and the United States during the Cold War. And in historical terms, this is an anomaly. It's flat out strange, And I would go so far as to argue that it's a paradox. And the paradox is this, that the rising power and the status quo power that it's challenging are locked in a zero-sum conflict for geopolitical dominance. And at the exact same moment, those two countries are in a deep, profound, mutually beneficial, positive-sum relationship of economic interdependence in which they both gain, they both grow, they both become extraordinarily rich as a result of this interaction, and in which there is some kind of mutually assured economic destruction. If the United States suddenly were to say that it was going to stop buying Chinese goods, that would be challenging for many American retailers, and it would be very frustrating for American consumers who are accustomed to buying Chinese products of increasingly high quality for very little money. But it would be an epic disaster for China, because the Chinese Communist Party, about which I'm going to speak a little bit, relies for its legitimacy primarily, though not exclusively, upon economic growth. And the core engine of that growth remains trade, and the United States remains a crucial trading partner. That means the Chinese economy could not survive in the short term the removal of the United States as a trading partner. The consequence is that the Chinese Communist Party itself could not maintain its legitimacy, most likely, if the United States took that action. At the same time, China could, under those circumstances, begin to dump US debt. And although it couldn't do so without hurting itself tremendously, nevertheless, the resulting loss of confidence in US debt would have severe and significant consequences for the United States, at least so long as the United States remains a debtor nation. Now, let me be really clear. This interdependent relationship is one that both sides would actually like to reduce. The United States would like to owe a lot less money to everybody, and certainly not to China. And China, for its part, would like to diversify its economy so it's less dependent on external trade and definitely less dependent on trade to the United States. Indeed, the key for China to come out of the mild correction that it's in now and to sustain continued economic growth is to develop its domestic market. And developing your domestic market is a great way to not be fully dependent on foreign trading partners. Part of the reason that each of the countries wants to do this is that they know that they're extremely vulnerable to threats from each other. What I want to suggest first is that there is, in fact, an emerging bipolar relationship in which globally the United States and China are increasingly the most significant global powers, the United States having been so and China becoming so, and I'll talk about that more in a moment. And that bipolar relationship is characterized by this paradoxical combination of struggle in the realm of politics and cooperation in the realm of economics. It's not going to be another Cold War, but I do think it will have the characteristics of what we might come to call a cool war between the countries. Now, the first reaction that I think a person could reasonably have to this is to say, well, look, you're getting ahead of yourself. China is not yet a global superpower on par with the United States. Its military is nowhere near technologically as advanced as the United States. It's not as big. And what's more, it's not China's obvious or immediate interest to challenge the United States, and certainly not to challenge the United States militarily in a global way. There's a lot of truth to that line of thought. But there are also significant indications to suggest that the military gap between the two countries is closing, and closing fast, and that China's desire to become the regional power in Asia is, in effect, tantamount to China wanting to become a global superpower. So to make the first of those points, all you need to do is look at the headlines of the last month with respect to cyber attacks by China on American military technology. If you are stealing somebody's best fighter jet plans, which China has done, and China now has a fighter jet that looks very much like ours, if you are stealing plans for their global missile defense program, you are doing that either to get around that program or to build one of your own. And as we know from our everyday lives, if there is a product that's made in the United States today, if you hand the blueprints over to China, China can make that product at a high degree of quality. China is not yet in a position to invent its own technological advances, but that doesn't matter if it can steal and steal effectively. In a world where the blueprints are easily stealable, apparently, as we now know, and where China can build what it can steal, for which it can steal the plans, the gap between the United States and China is not the 20-year military gap of which experts confidently spoke 2 or 3 years ago. It's something much, much smaller. And again, we're talking about a relative change, not an absolute rise in Chinese power. It's relative to the United States. To demonstrate the second point about China's growing interest in becoming a regional power in Asia, one really need not look much further than China's fairly aggressive actions on the small islands all around it, which it typically claims as part of China and which typically no other country recognizes as part of China. China has been extremely aggressive with respect to each of these islands, militarizing conflicts over them and asserting its position there. It has also been growing its military at a rate of around 10% a year. It's bought a used and not very good aircraft carrier. I think it was formerly a Ukrainian, formerly a Soviet model. But it bought it so that its pilots could get some practice landing because they're building 2 better ones that are in the works now. You don't build aircraft carriers to be friendly. You build aircraft carriers because you don't want the United States to be the only global power with the capacity to send aircraft carriers into the Taiwan Strait. Now, China says openly that it believes that Taiwan should be part of China. And the United States does not say openly that we don't want that to happen. We have a policy of what we call strategic ambiguity, according to which, that's actually the name of the policy. I know it sounds like a laugh line, in which we say we would not be happy if such a thing should happen. We don't openly say we would defend Taiwan, but we signal that we would like to defend Taiwan. Now, it's not in Chinese interests, let's be clear, to sail into the Taiwan Strait with aircraft carriers and say we want a war, because that might motivate the American public to want to defend Taiwan. It's in China's interest just to grow its military to the point where no one would credibly think in the United States that we would go to war to protect Taiwan. And let me just ask, the lights are modestly bright on me, but I would like to see a show of hands on this. Leaving aside the question of some Chinese invasion, do you believe, this is the question, do you believe that the United States should be prepared to go to war to defend Taiwan? So first the yeses. Who believes that we should be prepared to go to war to defend Taiwan? Wow. For those of you who are watching this and can't see the audience, I'm seeing 1, 2, 3 hands, 4, 5. How many think we should not be prepared to go to war to defend Taiwan? The great majority of the room. Okay, so this is an educated, sophisticated, and worldly audience. It believes we're already in the moment. You all believe we're already in the moment where we wouldn't do that. Well, if we wouldn't do that, then you have to ask yourselves rationally, what's to stop China from simply assimilating Taiwan? Now, you may say that's not such a big deal. It happened with Hong Kong, and it wasn't the end of the world. And indeed, China is offering the same deal on Taiwan that it offered on Hong Kong. We'll be one country, but we'll have 2 systems. Needless to say, the Taiwanese don't feel very optimistic or happy about this. They overwhelmingly tell people who ask in polls that they don't want to be part of China. And in the last elections, 47% of Taiwanese voted for a party that was an independence party, that flatly said they want to sort of declare formal independence from China, which China has said would be a cause for war. Now, if we wouldn't defend Taiwan, I guess the next question is, would the United States go to war to defend Japan or South Korea from China? Now, it's not clear why the South Koreans or the Japanese should believe that the vote would be any different on that question. And if that's the case, then China isn't on its way to becoming the regional superpower in Asia. It's already in a position of being the regional superpower in Asia. Now, you may say, well, that's just Asia. Perhaps you don't say that. Asia is more than half the world by population. It's more than half the world measured by GDP. It's, in practical terms, a region which counts as at least half the world. That means, arguably, that we're already in or on our way to a world where there is a deep bipolarity, where there is the United States on one hand with its Western allies, and China on the other hand with her allies. Now, in a configuration like that, if I've at least gotten you thinking about that view, if you at least are now willing to consider that possibility, it's not like the rest of the world doesn't matter. The rest of the world matters enormously, and we and China trade extensively with countries throughout the world. not just in the oil and other energy resource-rich Middle East and increasingly in Africa, where other resources are to be had, but also in Central and Latin America. I mentioned Central America in passing just because China is commencing on a project, how many of you have heard of this actually, of building a parallel canal in Nicaragua to parallel the Panama Canal. You may ask, why are they doing that? Probably they think it's a good business venture, but from a symbolic standpoint, we're talking about something that the United States did in a period where it was trying to make it very clear that it was the hegemon in the entirety of the hemisphere. And China wants to make it clear that it's not dependent on the United States, that our capacity to close the Panama Canal is not the end of the game. It's another way of signaling their own independence. So there are countries in the rest of the world that matter enormously. And as in the Cold War, they are subject to a race for alliances. But there's a big difference between what happened in the Cold War and what's happening now with respect to these alliances. And that difference is, and it's not trivial, that in this round, in the Cold War, you can play both ends against the middle much more effectively. You can be militarily allied with the United States and economically aligned with China. So South Korea and Japan, which are assuredly US military allies, they desperately need the United States to make sure they're not swept into total Chinese hegemony, are simultaneous to their hostility to China on military terms, negotiating free trade arrangements with China, even as we speak. We're also trying to negotiate a free trade arrangement that will compete with their free trade arrangement, and it's not actually going as well as the Chinese negotiations are going. Because you can see from their perspective what's desirable. What's desirable is to be protected by the United States while maintaining a rich and full economic relationship with China. That's all well and good until your alliance with China economically pulls you into the Chinese category and makes it a lot harder to maintain this situation. But for the moment, that's the world in which we live. Again, totally unimaginable in the Cold War, in which you basically had to pick a side. There were some non-aligned nations that managed somehow to avoid this, but it was quite challenging for them to sustain that position. Now, where is this going? I think to understand where it's going and to try to make some sense of how it can be prevented from becoming an actually violent war, we need to look at the internal governance structures of the United States and China. About the United States, I'll say really just one word, and that word is nationalism. You know, there was a wonderful phrase that China used for a good long time to describe its rise. It was a slogan, and this phrase was, China's peaceful rise. That's a great slogan. America's peaceful decline is not a great slogan. That is not a slogan that realistically, I think, you could use to run for president of the United States. Anyone running for president in the next cycle and the cycle after that and after that, whether Democrat or Republican, is going to be put in a position of having to take a firm stand on where he or she stands with respect to China. And it will not be possible for that stand to be, we are very happy for China to become the other global superpower. That's not a sustainable position, I think, for an American politician, at least not right now. On the Chinese side, there's much more to be said, because I think that the Chinese internal system of governance is much less well understood globally and in the United States. And here I want to just say very briefly that although China is absolutely not a democracy, and although it is very much an authoritarian system, it is not a dictatorship. It has had peaceful transitions of political authority within the Chinese Communist Party 3 times now at intervals of a decade. And in those intervals, an internal process for the selection of the next group of leaders has taken place in a way that was not at all transparent, but that was nevertheless visible, understandable, and in an important way, predictable by the Chinese public sometime in advance. The Chinese Communist Party, as it tries to become an institutionalized governing party, wants to solve the problems that democracy solves without becoming a democracy. It wants to have the capacity for smooth transitions, which it already has. It wants to have very limited free speech, typically on the internet, typically lasting 15 or 20 minutes until the internet censors shut it down, during which time the Chinese government can figure out what people's concerns are and act to address those concerns. This lets off steam. It allows an opportunity for communication. It allows the central government to do better supervising regional governments, which is an enormous challenge that China has always faced and still faces. And it is a way of facilitating a kind of not very free, but a little bit free speech. Last but not least, the Chinese Communist Party is learning how to substitute itself, how to build its own membership through a system that essentially allows you both to rise by merit if you're extremely smart, aggressive, and hardworking, and also to gain the benefits of family connections if you come from a very prominent, powerful, and rich family. It's a mixed system where the elite is made up both of meritocrats and of people who've inherited power, and in that it resembles nothing so much as the United States, where we too allow you to become president if you were Bill Clinton or Barack Obama and came from very modest beginnings, or if you're George W. Bush or George H.W. Bush and came from slightly more august surroundings. And by the way, just to be clear, this is not purely party political in the United States. You know, Al Gore also would count as a princeling in Chinese terms. And you know, there's more to be said about that question of, well, in the United States, but certainly with respect to China, China has a mixed system. That means that the overwhelming incentive of the Chinese Communist Party is to remain in power and to maintain stability. And for that, it needs economic growth, but that's not enough. It also needs to achieve Chinese national commitment to a national project. And the new president, Xi Jinping, has a slogan. You may say it's not a very original slogan. The slogan is Chinese Dream. And the idea is that there should be an individual Chinese dream of personal economic success and a collective Chinese dream. And that collective dream operates not just at the national level, but at the international level as well. Now, I don't want to leave you with a sense of tremendous pessimism. Instead, I want to suggest that there are reasons to be optimistic about how things are developing, and then I want to open it up for conversation. The source for optimism is that the depth of economic interdependence between the United States and China allows an extraordinary opportunity for leveraging the positive aspects of the relationship to manage the structural conflict that's also inherent in the relationship. And that stems straightforwardly from human incentives. It's not a utopian vision, it's a practical vision. And I want to give you one concrete example drawn from the realm of international trade law. Now, there's usually no duller word than you can say in the world than international trade law. If anyone is still listening to you at that point, they generally stop. And that's reasonable, but what I want to say is that international trade law is an example of an international law regime that's actually law. You know, for generations, people have said international law is a nice idea, but it's not really law because there's no sovereign to enforce it. Well, there's no sovereign to enforce international trade law, but countries all over the world, including the United States and including China, belong to the WTO regime. They subject themselves to WTO tribunals that make judgments against them. They pay the damages they're supposed to pay. And then they don't take their ball and go home. They re-subject themselves to the same trade regime again, and they do it for one reason and one reason only: self-interest. The interest of both sides, and indeed of countries all over the world, in remaining in this regime is so great that it causes them to treat it like it's really law, actually to treat the dictates of the system as though they truly matter. Under those circumstances, there are lots of places where China and the United States can and does cooperate straightforwardly for mutual benefit and advantage. And because it would not be rational for either of them to go to war with each other, the positive self-interest component here can potentially, I don't want to be too optimistic, but I do want to be optimistic, can potentially facilitate greater communication, greater understanding, and most importantly, reduce the likelihood of violence. There are tripwires like Taiwan or South Korea and North Korea that could go terribly wrong. There are also examples of places in the Middle East where China is de facto a backer of Iran and therefore of Syria, and we are increasingly backing the other side in Syria. And a proxy war like those that occurred in the Cold War is not impossible. So the risks are real, they are great, and they are continuing. But the capacity and the possibilities for management are there through mutual self-interest. And we should be aiming for that because the goal for everybody in the world should be to keep this cool war cool and avoid at all costs its becoming hot. So there is an argument. I've given it to you in a very concise, I hope, somewhat concise form. There are lots of holes in it that I've tried to plug in the longer book version. But I'm eager to hear your thoughts, your comments, and your objections, and to try to take a crack at convincing you that there's something to the analysis. Thank you very much for listening, and I'm very eager to hear your thoughts. We've got plenty of time, so dive right in. Otherwise, you'll get me talking more, and you don't want that. Yes, please. There are microphones coming around.
Hi, I have two quick questions. One is, as you said at the beginning, some of this seems to be a little bit self-inflicted and that our nation doesn't seem very interested in investing in, for example, our own infrastructure, our own economic growth to the same extent that we were in the past. You know, some of our great cities and places we built because we wanted to compete with the Soviet Union, and now we don't seem to care about that. Do you see there being a certain threshold at which suddenly the mood of the populace switches back to, we really need to make America greater because otherwise we're going to lose out, as opposed to this sort of, you know, this feeling now that it doesn't really matter. Second question is, what, maybe, and maybe you talk about this in the book, like what would be a good thing to happen? Are we, you know, should we try to be in a position where we keep on being more powerful militarily than China, and what does that future look like? Or is there just sort of going to be a more of a parity and a status quo as opposed to us kind of winning? Or rather, what does winning mean?
Yeah, those are both terrific questions. If you don't mind, I'll take them in reverse order. Start with this question of, should we be trying to essentially contain China by continuing to grow our military to create the incentive in them not to grow theirs? Right? I mean, think about that. It sounds paradoxical, but it's also true. My short answer is that we probably have to do that. And let me give an example of why, using the European Union as the example. Now, the European Union looks like a miracle. Okay? I mean, for most of the last several centuries of Western history, the countries of Europe were in vicious war with each other. And if it wasn't France and Britain at war with each other, it was Germany and France on one side and France and Britain at war with each other. And after the Second World War, a decision was made to demilitarize Germany forcibly with the goal of creating a new set of incentives that would not lead to World War III. And you know, there was debate about how it should be tried, but overall there was a consensus among the victors that this should be done. And after it happened, it worked. And it worked better than most people had even imagined, because Germany, realizing that it did not any longer have the option of rising as a military power, realized it wasn't in its interests to do so. It's never in your interest to do something that's impossible. That's just a logical impossibility. So as a result, Germany grew economically and decided that if other people would agree, it would simply dominate the continent of Europe, or Western Europe, economically. And since the rest of Western Europe was willing to take that deal, with some troubles in recent years, that has worked. And the reason that we actually broke, by we I say, you know, the global community, broke the cycle of military fighting in Europe, it's not a small thing to have accomplished. You know, from 1648 to 1945, nothing but wars. Right? It's a 300-year history actually broken. And it was broken in part by the tremendous advantages that people experience in trading with each other and the positive gains they could get from them. But those gains were available before the Second World War as well, and they weren't sufficient to block Germany's military rise. What was sufficient was that Germany realized it couldn't rise militarily, and so it wouldn't try. By the way, almost the exact same story for Japan, which was also forcibly demilitarized after the war. Now, we can't forcibly demilitarize China for the simple reason that we haven't fought a grand war against them and defeated them. So we can't achieve that. We could, however, potentially convince China that it's in China's interest to accept something like the status quo, where the United States spends a lot of its time and money ensuring some degree of global stability, parentheses, except when we decide to disrupt global stability. I heard someone say yesterday, very wisely, that the word disrupt has been the word of the last decade. And the comment was made in the context of economics and, you know, disruptive economic forces. And I actually wondered in my mind whether there's some unconscious association between our intervention in Iraq, which was an intentionally disruptive military intervention, and then the growth of that word over the last decade in the economic context. Of course, I don't mean consciously. Clay Christensen had his ideas, you know, before we invaded Iraq, but I wonder if there's some unconscious association there. Anyway, close parentheses. The point simply is that it is probably in the US interest to try to convince China that it ought not try to grow its military at an incremental rate that catches up to and eventually challenges the United States within Asia. There are many who believe that China's own strategic interests dictated that it not do this. There are many who believe that China can't do this even if it tries. that the challenges that it faces internally are so enormous, and I hope people will ask about those, and I'm happy to talk about them, that the challenges it faces internally are so enormous that it can't get here even if it does try, and there's not that much to worry about as a consequence. I'm not convinced of either of those things, but I do think that the Chinese leadership is, in the end, at this stage, highly rational. And if the United States raises the cost, China might have reason to back down. In the recent meeting between President Obama and Xi Jinping, it was crucial for President Obama to communicate that the cyber attacks were not okay. That we perceive them as a military threat. Whether he did that or not, we don't know. We don't have a clear sense of exactly what went down in the summit. And that's also by design. Now, with respect to your first question, which is a really rich question about American internal attitudes in light of this change, clearly we need to move away from a self-conception as nothing other than being a nation of consumers. I mean, it wasn't irrational when President Bush told people after September 11th to go shopping. It was poorly chosen political rhetoric, but it wasn't a crazy thing to say. I mean, what he was saying was, we can actually inflict substantial damage upon ourselves if we constrict and contract our economy for emotional reasons. But it also reflected the thought that at that crucial historical moment, the president thought, what are we basically? We're basically a nation, in economic terms, we're basically a nation of consumers. That's not, in the long run, going to be sustainable in a world where economically we're facing a challenge such as the challenge we're facing from China. That said, China wants to be more like us. China wants its people to be much greater consumers. I mean, how do you develop a domestic market? People have to start buying stuff. And in China right now, people in the big cities do buy things. If you're in Beijing, as I'm sure many of you have been, the number of people who are using their smartphones is comparable to or greater than what you would see in a major American city. And in rush hour in the subway in Beijing, those smartphones actually work in the subway, and everybody's using them. So China wants that to spread across the country. They want to be greater consumers. They want to move away from a self-conception of sacrifice and towards a self-conception of, hey, life is pretty great, let's spend some money. So, would this shift the United States in the other direction? It's conceivable, but the question is, could that be done without active nationalist sentiment? And in my view, nationalist sentiment here is really scary. It's really frightening. There's a nationalist impulse to say, oh my goodness, China just bought, a multi-billion-dollar pork-producing company. What's next? I think that's a mistaken impulse. It's great if there's, as somebody put it rather bluntly, too much pork here and not enough pork there. Right? This is a desirable economic relationship to exist. And nationalism that pushes against it is costly. And it's going to be a real challenge for an American politician who wants to inspire people to say, look, work harder and produce because we're competing with China. Oh, but by the way, even though China is capable of eating our lunch and China is our most serious global competitor, don't hate the Chinese so much that you think we need to go to war against them. Oh, but I think we need to arm ourselves. Right? All without becoming nationalist. That's a very difficult thing to pull off in a democracy, extremely difficult to pull off. Yes, please. Can you just wait one moment and the mic will come to you?
I enjoyed your conversation, and I agree about China and the importance with the United States and in America. But this one has really bothered me since I was there right after Nixon and then later on. How does a country become wholesome and grow and build products and sell them when they still believe in infanticide and when the men are walking around with no women? And it hasn't changed, or at least I read everything and it hasn't changed. And I just wondered, in your extraordinary background on China, talk to me about that now, and how do you feel? Because it isn't just one pocket, it's the entire nation. Mm-hmm.
It's a terrific and a hugely important point. The first thing I would say is I don't think that the Chinese people as a whole ever wanted infanticide. I think the Chinese Communist Party wanted a one-child policy, and social norms and some degree of economic self-interest pushed so hard in favor of male children that we got this horrific tragedy of hundreds of millions probably of girls killed as a result of this disastrous and ill-chosen policy. That policy is also coming back to haunt China, leaving aside the moral side, in economic terms, because just as you said, there are large parts of the country where there are no women at all. So it's a huge ongoing challenge. The first thing I would say is, I think there is a significant rethinking of the one-child policy. And I think in many parts of the country, it's been softened to a degree where it doesn't exist, especially in rural areas. And in urban areas, I think over time, we're likely to see more softening of it. In terms of Men Without Women, which I think is the title of a Hemingway short story also, and nothing goes very well in that story, if I remember correctly. I think China is moving in the direction of importing women from even poorer countries. It doesn't sound great, and it obviously raises the risks of kind of formalized trafficking in ways that are very, very troubling. But as the numbers of places where there's a disparity rise, it's a social challenge with which the Chinese government must deal. And it's very likely that that's the route that the Chinese government, on average, will take to deal with it, trying to do it in a low-key way so as not to attract significant global condemnation. Your question raises, beyond this, the deep problem of human rights, which I didn't speak about at all, although I spend almost a third of the book talking about it. So let me say just a quick word about that, if you don't mind. The first point is that the Chinese official conception of human rights is fundamentally different from ours, and remains so. To the extent we care about democracy, the rule of law, and human rights in terms of freedom from arbitrary arrest, the opportunity to live your life making choices that are important to you in your own way, those are simply not things that the Chinese Communist Party presently recognizes. As a result, there is deep and pervasive violation of human rights within China. And this represents a deep and continuing ideological point of difference between us and China. In fact, one of the weirdest things about the Cold War is that it is ideological, but it's only ideological in one way. In the Cold War, we thought that our ideology was the best ideology in the world and that everyone should follow it. And the Soviets thought their ideology was the best in the world and everyone should follow it. Today, China's government is wholly pragmatic. It's communist in name only. It's really state-guided capitalism. But the Chinese government has no great interest in convincing other countries to adopt their governance model. If other countries would like to, I suppose they're happy enough to tell them about it. And if you look at what's happened in Egypt the last several days, tragically and horribly, it makes you realize that democracy isn't that appealing to a lot of places around the world. And even though right now, after an event like the Arab Spring, where you have a chance to pick your own government, most countries say, oh great, democracy, I'm not at all sure that 5 years from now, that's still going to be the norm globally. So there may be more countries looking at the Chinese model. But it's not the Chinese Communist Party that's out there evangelizing for it. The ideology is all on our side. And our side has the view, for the most part, the Western side has the view for the most part, that violations of human rights, like the ones that exist in China, are fundamentally unacceptable. Now let me say something from the other perspective, that is from the Chinese perspective. The Chinese Communist Party does have a theory of human rights. And its theory runs basically like this. If you are allowed to vote and to worship freely, to go to school and choose any job you want, and you live in Calcutta or Mumbai on $1 a day, you don't actually have any rights. Because your rights have to be measured by your capacity and capability to actually live the life you want to live. And so economic well-being is the most basic and fundamental groundwork upon which all rights have to be built. Now, that position is not crazy. In fact, that position is not that far from what philosophers like Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum in our system, in the West, have argued for in what they call their capabilities approach to human rights, where they say that human rights is about maximizing your capabilities, and if the world is arranged in such a way that you can't do what you want to do, your rights aren't actually worth that much. I don't know that the Chinese Communist Party is actually reading Amartya Sen, but in the more sophisticated circles, people do read and discuss broadly. In a university in China, there's something very close to free speech, and people do read all of the texts that we read in the West. And I think there's an awareness of this argument. Now, from this, the Chinese Communist Party draws a conclusion that I'm not personally in agreement with, but again, which is not crazy, which is that the only way to increase the economic well-being of people in China is for the Chinese Communist Party to remain in power. And for a counterexample, they point to the Soviet Union, which after its collapse tried democratization with disastrous results. And in the end, the public in Russia more or less acquiesced in Putin's rise and to the reduction of the human rights that we're talking about and that we care about so much. And their view is, well, this happened precisely because you need stable, coordinated governance for the transition and economic growth. And then when that's over, 25 or 35 or 50 years from now, then we can talk about freedom of speech and freedom to worship. Right? That is a view. I mean, I'm describing in rough terms a view that one will hear from some sophisticated Chinese intellectuals who would count as probably left on the Chinese spectrum, but who are actually, with a small c, profoundly conservative. They're Burkeans. They don't want rapid change because they fear what it can lead to. You know, that view of human rights is a view that must be grappled with. And I don't think that we in the West, who are so confident with the near religious devotion, which I think is appropriate to our ideal of human rights, we need to remember that there's an alternative view. I mean, to me, the best way to think about it is almost as though one were a deep religious believer, and then you meet another person who's also a deep religious believer. You know, you have your values, she has her values. You don't agree with her values, but you ought to be respectful of them, and at least think through the ways in which they might make sense to her, even as you try to convince her that actually your views are better than hers. And that's, I think, the undertaking that we need to be engaged in. Last but not least, there's a strategic side to human rights. You know, I don't need to tell this audience that the United States has not in history evoked human rights out of a deep sense of justice and good in the world. We've evoked them situationally to beat up the Soviets at the end of the Cold War. Never bothered us that we were, for example, fully allied with Saudi Arabia, which is a serious and serial human rights violator, which does not treat women as equal citizens, which does not allow free speech, which does not allow elections, you know, in which free speech is far more constrained. Speech is far more constrained than it is in China. But you know, Saudi Arabia has been one of our closest allies uninterruptedly, and we've mostly been able to live with that. So it's not as though we've used human rights in some pure way. And that will be true with respect to China as well. We can use human rights situationally as a mechanism to criticize China. And it's an important argument for us to the South Koreans and the Japanese, and above all to the Indians, that says reasons you should be with us. Right? In our column, human rights. We actually share the same values and beliefs on this topic, and we actually will try to encourage those things. Points on the other side, you know, China doesn't. And as we try to build global alliances, it's actually hugely important that we be able to point to this. And it will have that particular mix of self-interest and sincerity that we Americans are so good at. And it will meet with the skepticism in China. It does meet with the skepticism in China that is common and I think probably appropriate from their perspective. Yes, please. Could you just wait for the mic for 1 second? Sorry, it's almost there.
Would you discuss corruption as an American corporation sees it in China, and as you described, government-controlled capitalism in China suffers from its own corruption?
Absolutely. I think that the single greatest challenge that is facing China now, and the one that is actually most capable of disrupting the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party, is corruption. And I want to distinguish here two different kinds of costs of corruption. One kind is the purely economic kind, right? I mean, corruption is a kind of a tax on a growing economy. And although there are examples in the world of countries that have grown very fast, among them actually South Korea, despite very substantial corruption, in many places in the world we know that economic development has been slowed down and even stalled by pervasive corruption. And a sort of variant version of that tax is when the state is allocating capital through state-controlled banks. And in the first instance, even a fully well-intentioned non-corrupt state will make a lot of mistakes when it allocates capital, more than the free market will. So that's going to be a cost. But when you add in corruption, and as we all know, just from the newspapers, the leading figures in China are almost without exception deeply enmeshed in webs of tremendous wealth generated by their government position, which can only be described as profound corruption, they will allocate capital in ways that are even more irrational then it would have been allocated by, let's imagine, well-meaning economists who happen not to be shaped by the constraints of the market. So those are huge costs. And they fall under the category of economic costs of corruption. They're big, and the economists who work on this think that they're very significant. All I can say is that most of the economists who specialize in corruption in China tend to think that these costs, though significant, are survivable. They tend to think that the other forms of growth within the Chinese economy are so significant that they have continued, they can outweigh this. And there's some question of why that should be. And just to add an interesting kind of footnote to that, one theory about why corruption has been somewhat limited in China has to do with the way that economic growth in China is measured at regions and provinces. So you're a leader and you're sent out to a region or province and you're put in charge and you're told we're going to measure your success by the economic growth in your region or your province, and we're going to check that against everybody else, and you're going to be promoted within the party, which means power and potentially riches if you grow, and not if you don't. Well, that creates competition. And the competition between different locales and provinces for business, for investment, gives people an incentive not to eliminate corruption, but to keep it at manageable levels. This is a theory, by the way, that was invented to explain why corruption in urban centers in the United States seems to have been ample but not overwhelming in the 19th century, the period when rapid growth was happening in the United States. That's where this theory was invented, and it's now being applied in China. Again, is it true? No one really knows for sure. The second kind of cost of corruption is the legitimacy cost. And this is, in my mind, much more serious from the standpoint of the Chinese Communist Party than even the significant economic cost. If you are an ordinary Chinese person, the legitimacy of the party depends on your life being better given that they're governing than it would be if they weren't governing. It's them or the alternative. And if you think that the people who govern you are governing you not for your own good, but to feather their own nests, it's a reason to distrust the system. And it's a reason to think that some alternative system might be better. The party knows this, and this is why a central component of Bo Xilai's program when he came into power has been to focus the party on reducing the appearance of corruption. And it's actually amazingly overt in its focus on appearance. One of the slogans is, look yourself in the mirror and imagine what other people will see, right? Not look into your soul, just look in the mirror, right? The perception of corruption for the second kind of cost, the cost of legitimacy, is more important than the reality of corruption. So that's a hugely significant issue. I just want to say, when a major figure like Bo Xilai, who was a rising figure within the party, a very senior figure in the party, I tell his, I think, very dramatic story. I hope I told it dramatically, but I tell it in the book in any event. When he fell from power and was shown to have been corrupt in various ways, despite being someone whose reputation came in part from anti-corruption, a lot of people in the West looked and said, you see, the system is cracking, right? Here's a senior guy who was on his way potentially to the Politburo Standing Committee, and he was revealed to be corrupt and he was purged. That will convince the public in China surely that the system is basically broken. Well, there's something to that, but there's also the other perspective, which is that he was caught, and an example was made of him. And that's a way of shoring up your legitimacy, by showing the public, look, we know there's corruption, there are bad apples, and they don't make it all the way to the top. You know, the system actually is promoting the good people and cutting down the bad people. Now, nobody in China is naive enough to think that it does that perfectly. The question is it doing it relatively well? I mean, no one in our system thinks that democracy always chooses the best, most effective person to govern. Certainly no one in our country today believes that the system of democracy is an efficient way of deciding major questions of national importance. You know, we look at our dysfunctional Congress and we throw our hands up in the air and we say, gee, it's really dysfunctional. But we don't think, well, what are the alternatives to democracy that we should try out? Because we think that bad as it is, and lately it's looked, frankly, pretty bad, it's definitely better than the alternatives. So that's all that an ordinary Chinese person has to believe. He simply has to believe that relative to the alternatives available right now under these conditions, the system that exists is on the whole better. And so if you can manage the perception of pervasive corruption, you can help shore up legitimacy. But I think that risk is the greatest risk. And it comes essentially from a problem of collective action. Collectively, the Chinese Communist Party wants to stem corruption. Individually, each member wants to steal as much as he or she can get away with. Yes, please.
Leisha John, Ernst & Young Environmental Sustainability. I'm curious to know what you think the impact will be of depleting resources on our relationship. We see that China is already starting to secure rare earth minerals.
Yeah, I'm glad you raised the environmental issue and the resource-related issues. I mean, first of all, it matters tremendously for alliances globally. You know, I mean, China has actively sought alliances in Africa, for example, primarily because there are resources there. And they do it a little differently than we did it or that Western Europe did it at the height of the scramble for Africa, that they don't claim it's going to be good for the Africans. You know, but the sort of overt statement that says, we want your resources and this is what we'll give you, is a pretty direct one. And it's led to some people saying there is almost a new colonialism in Africa, in some parts of Africa, under Chinese influence, and whether that will be different than our version, the Western version, remains to be seen. In some cases, China's capacity to dominate an industry, like rare earth minerals, has more to do with its willingness to tolerate environmental degradation than anything else. Right? There are, it turns out, rare earth minerals available, as you know, in substantial quantities in lots of places other than China. And yet China is producing upwards of 95% of the world's rare earth minerals, which makes everybody very nervous. Well, why is that? It's because China has been willing, as a matter of government policy, to tolerate the tremendous environmental costs that come from that. So the Chinese government, this is a great example, are able to say and willing to say, you know, we're willing to take this price for the environment in exchange for this growth. And we're not constrained by a democratic public that says we don't want this. They are constrained, however, by public objection to the obvious forms of environmental degradation, which are everywhere in China, and certainly are true in an incredibly obvious way in Beijing, where the air quality is so extraordinarily poor that it's actively difficult to ride a bicycle around. This is a city that once had literally millions of bicyclists. And that's a cost that the party is openly talking about and openly discussing ways to improve. And environmental improvement has become a major plank in the public discourse of the party. I think the party's goal is to do that at a superficial level, and that will add greater legitimacy again. So I basically think that the resource issue is going to be constant, and it's going to be primarily expressed globally, and it will relate itself to the question of environmental challenges within China, which are very, very severe. Please. Then I promise to, I've got 5 more minutes, I promise to get out to the wings.
Hi, my name's Jen Bodden, and my question is regarding, as more countries move away from the petrodollar and transact directly, and with the Chinese citizens and government stocking up on gold, it looks like China plans to float a competing global currency one day. What are your thoughts on this, and how will this affect the balance of power?
It's a wonderful and very important question. China already speaks openly about not wanting the dollar to be the sole global reserve currency. And they don't yet say that they want theirs to be a direct competitor. They talk about a plurality of options. But there is some reason to think that in the long run, that might be something that China would want under the right set of conditions. And you can see why. You know, the United States gets an economic free ride to some extent from the fact that the dollar is the global reserve currency. And you can see the real geopolitical consequences of that and their causes. It's not a coincidence that the other single global reserve currency historically was the pound sterling during the period of British global domination. One of the reasons, not the only reason, but one of the reasons for convergence on a single reserve currency has to do with global confidence that the country that issues that currency is in some important way too big to fail. That the world would be a very strange place if the value of that currency began to collapse, that things would be so radically different and bad that all bets would be off. In an increasingly bipolar world, it's difficult to imagine that it would be rational for investors to think that they should put all of their faith in dollars. That is a difficult thing to imagine. Over time, it seems probable that if the United States appeared no longer to be the sole global superpower, but one of two, and we're talking not about today or tomorrow, but over 25 or 30 or more years, there's reason to think that there would be space for alternative global currencies. That seems probable. It seems like a very slow process that will be cautiously and carefully negotiated on all sides because people have a lot to lose. But as a directional matter, it's hard to imagine that we won't see change in that direction. Yes, please, in the green shirt.
With regard to foreign policy, Because we are so mutually economically dependent, I'm wondering what the impact of that is, particularly on the world issue of Iran. And with China's support for Iran, how can the United States put more pressure on Iran to not only reduce its oil consumption, it has somewhat, but it's still supporting not only Iran, but many other sort of bad actors in the world?
Yeah, we are constrained. I mean, I think increasingly the United States is actively constrained by China's positions. Our capacity to push Iran, which is already limited in certain ways, is further limited by implicit Chinese support for Iran. It's further limited, for example, in the case of Syria, by China's unwillingness to allow a Security Council resolution. Right? I mean, the last few times we needed a Security Council resolution and we couldn't get one, Kosovo bombing or Iraq, we just went anyway. We're actually constrained to some degree by it now, not for legal reasons, but for pragmatic political reasons of China's power. That's part of the emerging reality of a Cold War situation, and China has chosen a lot of bad actors as its allies because they're low-hanging fruit. You know, they're available, and Chinese pragmatism makes them appealing partners. So that's a reality. Yes, please, sir.
Given China's military rise and our relative economic decline, is there much thought being given to the creation of an Asian NATO, which would include countries like India, Australia, Japan, South Korea, and maybe even Taiwan?
Yeah, you know, I think the short answer is not called that, but there is talk of strengthening what have traditionally been bilateral military relations between the United States and those countries, the so-called hub and spokes arrangement, where we're the hub and the spokes are relationships with those countries. And India in particular is crucial here. And the question is really, would India be interested in a kind of alliance of democracies or of regional democracies that would openly have the purpose of containing China? It's a very delicate matter from India's perspective. On the one hand, India does not want to provoke China. It's fought border wars with China before. It has a lot to lose. On the other hand, China is not in the position relative to India that it once was. China can now do almost everything that India can do in terms of economic growth, and India cannot do everything that China can do. And so the concern about constraint is a real one. And then I just want to close by saying the issue of democracy comes back there. The question is, can the United States plausibly make an argument to India that as fellow democracies, they have enough in common to participate in some process that constrains China without provoking it absolutely? And that's a microcosm of the Cold War in total right there. Thank you very, very much for listening. Thank you.